Good afternoon. Thank you all for tuning in to our Bulldogs Behind the Scenes webinar. Well, last month we hosted the Hartley Nature Center and had a chance to take a tour of the wonderful trail systems that they have. And this month we are excited to be hosting our second event highlighting the Glensheen Estate. My name is Molly Nelson and I am part of the UMD Alumni Relations team. Also on this call are my colleagues Matt Duffy and Austin Sommerfeld. Today's webinar is hosted by Zoom. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to note that on the bottom of the screen, there is a place for you to ask questions. It is titled Q&A. During the presentation, feel free at any time to type your question in, and Dan will try to answer as many of them at the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our alumni website with a link to YouTube. Once the video is ready, we will send a link directly to you. So today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dan Hartman. Today he serves as the director of the Glensheen Estate in Duluth, Minnesota. And under his leadership, Glensheen has doubled its attendance and ticket sale revenue, making it the most visited house museum in the Midwest. While a student at UMD, and his internship was with the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And also as a student, he was the recipient of UMD's Sir Duluth Award. On a personal note, Dan and his wife Elizabeth are proud parents of 4 amazing kids, Logan, Amelia, Liam, and Olivia, and they live right here in Duluth. Lastly, in general, he is a great big nerd. So please help me welcome Dan.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you to the UMD alumni for allowing me this opportunity. I'm always excited to talk about Glensheen. So that being said, as you saw, I'm a father of 4. I love this photo. I love that we bring our kids to museums regularly, and this is us trying to do our Triceratops pose. And as you can kind of tell, I'm a proud UMD grad and I'm a lover of museums. So, what is Glensheen? It's a gift from the Congdon family. And I think sometimes we get excited about all the other parts and we forget that this was this amazing gift that the family handed over to us. And, really it goes back to Guilford Hartley Congdon, who would have been the one who received Glensheen. And it was him who said, no, let's give it as a gift to the University of Minnesota. And at that point, the Congdon family had a long history of giving to the university. For example, if you go to the theater program, there is the Dudley Experimental Theater, which came from Marjorie Congdon Dudley as a donation. So, there's a whole slew of things like that. And so first off, I just want to say thank you to the Congdons for giving this gift to the state of Minnesota. But also, this is a huge university asset. Is first a research site. A lot of people don't realize that, but there are graduate work that's done here. There are year ops that are done here for research. We had a graduate student doing work on an eastern hemlock at one point. Even I, as an undergrad, did a year op here at Glensheen. So we kind of forget about that, but it happens. But also in the background, 3/4 of our staff are all University of Minnesota alumni. The lion's share of that are UMD students, but we actually even have U of M students who work here for the summer. Once again, even myself, I was a student tour guide here back in college, and almost half of the existing permanent staff were UMD students who now work here at Glensheen. And also, I think a little side thing, because these usually happen at night, but a lot of student groups and student clubs use Glensheen for a meeting space or an end of the year event, or for fun, like the history club. And I think that's just kind of that university connection that people don't hear about a lot, but is a very active part of Glensheen and something that I frankly enjoy watching a lot of. So back to what is Glensheen? It is awesome. This is why all these people are so involved in it, and it is the definition of awesome. And so I just want to spend time to reflect on what is so amazing about this place. It is this 12-acre estate on probably the nicest parcel of lakeshore property in the Duluth area. A lot of the Duluth North Shore is very rocky and kind of filled with cliffs, not Glensheen. It is a nice, slow, gradual hill down to the lake. It actually has 2 creeks that run to the property, Tisher and Bent Brook. And so just think of this as your own personal residential property. It's awesome. And I think sometimes we forget that at its base level, without the mansion and carriage house and gardener's cottage and boathouse, it's just an amazing parcel of property. That now belongs to the state of Minnesota for us, the public, to enjoy, which I think is incredible. It's also famous for the mansion, and the interior is something that is always inspiring for people. We have a lot of guests over time that have remodeled their homes inspired by Glensheen. This is that main hall that you walk into when you come into Glensheen. This is that reception room you walk into with that gold leaf ceiling. This is the library. I mean, think of this as your own personal library. How amazing would this be to sit in here with a book, with a fireplace going in the middle of January? I mean, it's just an amazing space. And our famous breakfast room, which usually wins on everyone's favorite room in the mansion contest, and it rightfully so. It almost feels like it's in the middle of nature. It's designed to feel like nature when you're inside of it, hence all the green. Plus, it's done by some of our best designers in the state of Minnesota. And so it also has this great Minnesota history connection, from the John Bradstreet part to the Minneapolis Handicraft Guild part, to the U of M story connected to the handicraft. I mean, there's just these great little Minnesota stories all in this one space. And then part of the tour that a lot of people haven't seen is the third floor. And the third floor is designed in this beautiful arts and crafts style that is very different from the rest of the house. This is the boys' lounge. And it's just, there's just so much to Glensheen. But the part that I really like is the grounds. It actually was my senior research in college, and it's still something today that I just am inspired by and really enjoy. So this is the famous Stone Arch Bridge over Tisher Creek. When you see photographs from the family, and when the family makes postcards of their house, the view is from Tisher Creek, showing the bridge, showing Glensheen. In fact, the book plate to every book in the library is a picture of this bridge and the house. And it's actually hand drawn on the outside by Marjorie Congdon herself back in 1912. But, you know, when the Congdons built this property, part of their design idea is that it would feel like this very refined and classy house in the rough exterior of the North Shore. And so that's why the bridges and a lot of the stonework outside of the mansion have that almost, you know, state park feel, is because they wanted it to feel like that. And a lot of the original visitors, Glensheen, their takeaway wasn't the beautiful interiors. It was really these beautiful trails that walked along Tisher Creek down by the lake. It just wasn't what they were expecting when they came to Minnesota from the East Coast. A lot of times they came to Duluth thinking it would be flat and farmland, but in reality, it was this beautiful, rugged environment next to the shore of Lake Superior. But also in the middle of that is your classic French-style garden with the symmetrical sides. And it's also a 3-tier terrace up to the mansion. It is just not a normal space. I love when you explain this to wedding parties. You're like, yes, you want to have your wedding on our 3-tier terrace? I mean, it sounds like something out of a movie. It sounds like a line from Anchorman. And I think that's what's so amazing about this place. We even have a vegetable garden. So, you know, for years, all of our produce would actually go to the local food bank. We recently realized that a lot of our students in particular could use the food themselves. And so now we give our food to our student population who frankly don't get a lot of fresh produce themselves. And our gardens actually are experimental gardens of the University of Minnesota's Extension Service. And so we'll have a variety of different corn to try. We'll have a variety of tomatoes. And then we actually will see how that went through our little microclimate here. And we'll record that data, and that goes to the Extension Service. But I love that we have this microclimate on the shore of Lake Superior where it's vastly different than how these same materials will survive up on top of the hill. And we've been doing that since the early 80s. This is something that's more recent, is I think we're coming to terms with this idea that this estate is more than just a mansion, and that we have these amazing ways to have people experience this estate. One of them is kayaking. This is actually me in a dress shirt underneath the Stone Arch Bridge, but it's, you know, this is a different way to experience Glensheen. So now we have guided tours in the summer along the lake, underneath Tisher Creek, where they talk about this other side of the history of Glensheen. And this has really led to this larger idea of viewing Glensheen as a community space, which has really changed a huge way we think of the estate. In fact, it's led to an entirely new mission statement where we continue to focus on the preservation of this beautiful historic environment, but we also have this idea that we want to celebrate it, that we want people to enjoy it. We want people to be inspired by the spaces, that they want to save other spaces. And so we have a new mission statement of celebrating preservation. So here's an example when we have these new events called Concerts on the Pier, where we put a band on the pier and people come via boat, paddleboard, they line our entire shoreline. And, you know, the last few shows we had over 2,000 people just enjoying the estate. And yes, this would be a fun event down at Park Point, but it's even better because it's on this beautiful historic built environment that we call Glensheen. And I think it's built a resurgence of love for Glensheen that people forgot even was here. They didn't realize that this, oh yeah, this is a public space. And so it's made us as staff rethink events in general. And then here is another event we did where we call it Chef in the Garden, where our staff pick produce directly from the vegetable. And then they have a local chef, this is actually from Blackwoods, who actually makes a meal in front of the audience from the produce made in our garden. And you can see they're literally in the middle of the garden. Here is that variety of carrots that I was talking about earlier. This one's just very photo friendly. We even have a Whiskey Wednesday in the fall where we have regional whiskeys of Minnesota where the distiller will come in or the distributor and talk about what's special about these things. It's kind of a throwback to what was going on with Prohibition at that timeline, and just a fun way to enjoy the estate. I mean, this is the garage, which the public rarely goes into, but that is a beautiful spot too. And one of the fun events that we have done is we have this thing called Shark Watching Society, where really it's just bonfires down by the lake and a cash bar. But families come with binoculars and they pretend to look for sharks down by the lake, and it's become a fun family event. And this shark theme is kind of taken a life of its own, and we're even thinking about new things to do with that as we speak. But it's just been a fun way to experience Glensheen differently, but especially the estate. So personally, and this came up as one of the questions for this event before, people ask me, what is my favorite thing about Glensheen? Why am I so passionate about this place? It's because I love the mystery of the discoveries that we keep still finding. One of my favorites, so one of my tour guides on her last day had come up to me and said, hey, in the basement of the house, there are these packages and they're behind the acrylic. And I'm just very curious what's in these packages. And I had said, I had no idea what she was even actually talking about. And then we pulled them up, and sure enough, this is what they are. They are the official drawings and descriptions for the building of the Panama Canal in Washington, in Panama. But here it is, the official correspondence sent to Chester Congdon, 3300 London Road, Duluth, from the Panama Canal. And so we opened them up, and it turns out that there's an 8-part series in there. And here's one of the maps. There's many, many maps, but this is the Panama Canal, kind of that aerial view. And, it's just detailing where it's going to go. But we even have drawings of the different engineering maps for the locks that are needed for the Panama Canal. And once again, this is in Glensheen. This has been in the basement of the mansion for 40 years, and we had no idea that it was even there. And this is just one of many. Last summer, we found a diving bell in the boathouse. We had heard legends that it existed. We actually thought it was not a diving bell. Turns out it was. And now it's like one of the last remaining diving bells in the upper Midwest, which I think is amazing. And that is what I love about Glensheen. So on that note, one of the stories that we've kind of been unearthing, and it was there before, but not the level of detail that we know now. And so one of the forgotten, what I call Duluth stories, because it's a major story in our city's development, and I would say the state of Minnesota's, and most people don't even know this ever happened. And I want to start with this. And when people envision Duluth, they envision it as it is today, where it is this beautiful place with trees along the hillside, trees up the North Shore. It is one of the great destination spots for tourism in Minnesota, if not the Midwest. But that's not how it looked to people when they came here in the 1890s. There is this great line from Chester in the legislature that Duluth was a desolate place because we had cut all of our trees down. It was freezing cold all the time. When you read descriptions from Congdon and the Merritt brothers and other folks, Duluth sounds more like Mordor than it sounds like it does today. And so I tell you that to think of this vision as we continue down this, a cold version of Mordor. If you know Lord of the Rings, you know what I'm talking about. This is a good photo representation of what Duluth in the summer looked like in the 1890s. They don't cut the trees down and then take the stumps out, guys. This just looks like this. And when you went from downtown to Glensheen, it didn't look very pretty. And so this was this general sense of our community. And so there was a huge push to do a lot of things. It is in this vein that early on, actually in the 1870s, a guy comes to our town named Jay Cook, who you may be familiar with. There's a statue outside of the Kitchigami Club, but really he's the major first developer of Duluth. Duluth is the best place in the country to start the Transcontinental Railroad, and it would go from Duluth all the way to the West Coast, because in his view, it would make the most sense commercially, since Duluth is as far west as you can get on the Great Lakes. So then all the shipping goods would go to Duluth and then head west to all these other bigger cities. Well, in his grand scheme to build up Duluth and the railroad, he actually went bankrupt, and then creates the Panic of 1872, in part because of him trying to help Duluth. Duluth starts off growing really quickly with this push, and when he goes bankrupt, the city goes away. Actually, its city status goes away. But later on, the Merritt brothers are up way north of Duluth, up in the Iron Range, and the Merritt brothers locate a very large deposit of iron ore on what is today the Mesabi Iron Range up in Mount Iron. And this rekindles a whole new interest in the development of Duluth. And the Merritt brothers are trying to find a way to get this iron ore to market, and they're starting to look for investors to help make this a reality. The first person they go to is Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie turns him down. He actually doesn't believe what they're saying is true. He's like, there's no way there's this much good iron ore on the top of the surface. I'll pass. I think he refers to it as a sample of dirt. But this gentleman, who happened to be in Minnesota for the Republican convention, decides, I'm going to check it out since I'm here. And so he goes north, sees what it is, and goes, whoa, this is the real deal. And so he immediately purchases land and realizes that he needs to find an attorney quickly to start running all of his business transactions in northern Minnesota. And that gentleman is Chester Congdon of Glensheen. And so Chester Congdon becomes really Henry Oliver's business agent while in Minnesota. And it's a very kind of a lucky break for Chester, but he gets involved right on the ground floor. Henry Oliver goes back out east. Henry Oliver, like Andrew Carnegie, is one of the largest folks involved in steel making at the time. And the eastern portion of the range really gets owned by Henry Oliver and, you could say, Congdon. And then the western portion still remains in the hands of the Merritt family. The Merritt family have also helped build the railroad line. They also have helped build the docks, but they've done that with a lot of borrowed money. And it turns out that behind the scenes, another gentleman was very actively involved as well, John D. Rockefeller. So the Merritt brothers didn't realize that one of the silent investors for a lot of their other investments was John D. And so when the Panic of 1892 happens, he consolidates all of this together. And I won't go into the long details, but long story short is he kind of did not do a great thing to the Merritt brothers and kicked them out for dramatically less money than they deserved. And now Rockefeller owns the entire that little chunk of the western Mesabi. He owns the railroad. He owns the docks. And quickly, Henry Oliver and Chester Congdon realize that they're going to get squeezed out by Rockefeller as well. So they look for another larger investor, and they go back to a familiar name, Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie still isn't a big fan of this, but it takes some time to go through a bunch of board approval process. But Carnegie Steel steps in and actually ends up buying 5/6 of the stock of Oliver Mining. And Carnegie and Rockefeller go to battle for the next 7 years, where they make a deal, they break a deal, they make a deal, they break a deal. And it creates major disruptions in the steel industry. And so eventually another person comes on the scene as a familiar name, J.P. Morgan. And so J.P. Morgan, doing what he does best, which is consolidating the business environment, raises the large amount of capital and buys all of Andrew Carnegie, all of Carnegie Steel, and all of his interest, and makes Andrew Carnegie the wealthiest individual in the world overnight. He also then indirectly buys out all of Henry Oliver stock, but he also buys out all of the stock that Chester Congdon had purchased in Oliver Mining as well. So Chester individually went from a stock value of $16 when he purchased it to $9,250 per share. This deal made a lot of men wealthy overnight. He also eventually then buys all of Johnny Rockefeller, and then they create a new company, and that company is called U.S. Steel. And U.S. Steel becomes the largest corporation in U.S. history at that time. And so I point this out because we as Minnesotans I don't think we realize that huge business history took place because of our Mesabi Iron Range and here in Duluth and in the range. I mean, it's all interconnected together. So while all of this is going on, Chester and Hartley together, going by the far west side of the Mesabi, over by the Grand Rapids area, and they start building this land up themselves. It's a whole other story there. But they go to U.S. Steel after it's formed and say, hey, we'll give you this land outright for around 10 mil. And U.S. Steel did it. And so Chester and Guilford Hartley became even wealthier overnight because of that land sale in particular. And, you know, those deals are really what led to the building of Glensheen. But also in the middle of the story, guys, there is a significant amount of wealth being poured into the community of Duluth and the area in general. So Jay Cook gets a lot of credit for the development of Duluth, but the lion's share of the money getting pumped into Duluth actually came from Rockefeller and Carnegie. And so that's part of that early story that we tend to forget. So one of the other parts that I think, you know, leads from that is a really interesting part is that in the later half or later last 5 years of Chester's life, he really wanted to leave a legacy. And in Duluth at the time, we're building the Skyline Drive, and he really wants to build a beautiful scenic drive from Duluth to Canada. And he wants to call it the Lake Superior International Highway. And he does a lot of things to make that a reality. We love this here in the state of Minnesota, but originally that old dirt path would wash away every heavy rainfall. And so really the North Shore was very much not accessible to the public. And he felt that that was wrong, especially things like Gooseberry Falls, Temperance River, Tetagooch. There were just natural sites up the shore that he felt everyone should have access to. And so he, in 1915, announces that he's going to give $1 million donation to start building this public road. In fact, he hires his own landscape firm to start designing the road. This is actually in our collection. The original design for Highway 61 from Duluth to Two Harbors was meant to look like this, with an automobile lane, a carriage drive, a walking path, a bike lane. How amazing would have that been from, you know, by the way, it was supposed to start at the start of London Road by the Armory, and then it would go all the way to Stony Point. And then the first state park he wanted would have been at Stony Point. They had purchased a large amount of that land. They had done a lot of other work for the city to take some of that land. And this was the legacy he wanted to leave, was this beautiful new drive up this natural feature of the shore. And eventually after his death, it takes a while to get restarted, but they go back to the family, and the Congdon family wants to, you know, keep that legacy alive. And so when they build the highway or the road from Duluth to Two Harbors, the family pays for a third of the road construction cost to Two Harbors. We actually have the documentation in our collection. Because they paid for it, here's actually the blueprint for the start of the highway sign that was meant to be built at the start of Duluth. And, you know, that history is kind of lost today. When we go up the scenic drive, when you see that little sign that says Congdon on it, no one knows the implication. And unfortunately, I'm hoping to change this, but there's not a single sign dedicated to Chester on anywhere on that drive, even though he was an instrumental part in creating it. And so, you know, that's where I kind of wanted to focus my stuff today on some of these stories that I think people don't typically know about. Hopefully this was entertaining to folks. Once again, I can't see any of you, so if you're bored and asleep, I'm sorry. But hopefully you learned some new stuff and you appreciate this amazing, awesome place that we call Glensheen.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dan. We appreciate you walking us through the history of Duluth and Glensheen. Now is the time for question and answer. So we did ask ahead of time questions that were submitted through the registration. But right now, if anyone has a question that they would like to ask, feel free to submit them down at the bottom of your screen. Our first question actually was submitted earlier, and it's a follow-up question regarding the Panama Canal. And so what is the connection between the Congdons and the Panama Canal?
That is a great question. We even had a student spend about 3 months trying to figure out why we have this. And we have no definitive answer. The best we have is an assumption. We know that the crew who eventually digs up the western portion of the Mesabi Iron Range has a direct relationship with the engineering crew in Panama. And so there's clearly some connection between them, and Congdon's in the mix of all of that. But our best case guess is that Chester was maybe an investor in the Panama Canal, and they were sending him that as an investor. But once again, no definitive answer yet, but great question.
Our next question asks, how did Glensheen come to be owned by UMD?
Yeah, this is a fun, complicated question. So I'll try to make this more entertaining and succinct. So as I said in the presentation, there is a long history of giving, literally all the way back to Chester when he gave funds to the Duluth Normal School, of the Congdon supporting the University of Minnesota. One of my favorite stories is Elizabeth had asked faculty to identify really smart women who needed financial support, and then they would identify, and then she would anonymously pay for their college throughout. And then, eventually sometimes they'd find out about it. I didn't find out about this from one of the women who was supported by Elizabeth, which I just think is a cool story. And there's a lot of them like that. Well, anyways, so when the family is debating what to do with Glensheen, they immediately, one of the first groups they go to is the university. And initially, the university doesn't know what to do with the property. They wanted to make it an interpretive center. There were some plans to make it a dorm facility, if you can believe that. There were plans to sell off in general as a financial gift. But it was donated actually in late 60s under the auspices that when Elizabeth Congdon passes away, it would then formally be gifted to the university. And in 1977, it became the formal gift of the university. And that's, I guess, my shorter version. There's a lot of complexity to that, but that's the short version.
Well, we have a couple questions about the family. The first is, do the Congdons ever visit the estate? And are there any descendants still living within Duluth?
Yes and yes. So I think there's about 10 or so that are still in Duluth, but there's probably around 200 plus around the country. And my guess is there's some listening to this right now. And we actually have a Congdon family member who serves on our advisory committee, and she has been a great source of knowledge and advice, my 7 years at Glensheen for sure.
Perfect. I guess on a personal note, what is the most interesting thing about Glensheen to you?
I kind of covered this a little bit in my speech, but it is this like almost Indiana Jones feeling that there's so much we still don't know. Until COVID, I was actually going to go to Arizona this spring to research the copper mining site at Chester because we really don't know a lot about it. And there's streets in a couple cities named after the Congdons. And so I kind of want to dig into that because we don't know a lot. The Panama Canal, what is the connection there? So I'm a historian by trade, and so that's something I think always excites me.
When do you expect Glensheen to reopen? And then also, are there any activities scheduled for the summer that might be available for the community to attend?
No, thanks for the nice softball there. Yeah, we are hoping to for sure open the mansion up for the summer. We will probably first open the grounds, but we still need permission to do that as well. But my hope is in the coming weeks, we can open the grounds. And I'm hoping for a July date for the inside of the mansion. I will say, like a lot of businesses, it's going to be a different operation than what people have witnessed before, just to make sure things are safe for everybody. And we are spending a lot of time right now making sure that this is a very safe environment. And I will say we're lucky that how the estate is arranged, it allows for a lot of social distancing in a variety of different ways. And so I'm excited for people to see the new Glensheen when it opens up. For events, that's a little dicey right now for the same reasons you can imagine.
Well, we do have a question about funding and wondering how Glensheen gets enough funding to maintain and renovate the mansion.
Yeah, great question. So the vast, vast majority of our operational costs year to year actually comes from ticket sales. And so people ask around, what's a small way to give back to Glensheen? Take a tour. Almost everyone on staff who exists is paid for by our ticket sale revenue. We have a small portion we get from donations and some university support, but otherwise, we're one of the very few museums in Minnesota that pay for the majority of its operation with just straight up ticket sales, which I think makes us a little bit more anxious to try new things to get people excited.
Awesome. And we have one more question here, wondering what is the estimated total cost to build Glensheen, and how much would Glensheen be worth now?
Yeah. So this is a fun, very complicated question. So the easy math is when it was originally built, the mansion itself was around $854,000 in 1908. If you do the just inflation calculator, it's around 32 million today. But if you were wanted to rebuild Glensheen today, it's much harder because a lot of the craftsmen don't exist that used to exist then. And so a lot of the materials are exponentially more expensive to rebuild. To give you an example, if we wanted to make all the repairs needed to bring Glensheen back to what it was in 1909, including a new boathouse, greenhouse, things like that, you're looking at around 40 million. And that's just the repairs. And so my estimation is probably near the 100 mark if you wanted to rebuild it from scratch in the same vein.
And then it looks like we have one question about the boathouse. Wondering when it will be open to the public, knowing that you were working on it a few years ago.
Yeah, we were in the process of working down that path, and unfortunately, in the middle of that, we found some other significant, more critical needs that we need to address in other parts of the estate, and so now that's kind of been put on the back burner. But I'm always looking out for that donor who would love to see that boathouse brought back up. It's one of the last remaining residential boathouses on the entire Lake Superior. Me personally, it's one of the things that I would love to see brought back. And yeah, I mean, how great would that be to have that original L-shaped pier that went 30 feet out in the lake and then 100 feet to the right. Imagine having a cocktail on the roof line of that boathouse. It'd be nothing better in Duluth. It'd be amazing. But we got some time on that one still.
This question is more about the wildlife around Glensheen. Has there been any wildlife spotted by visitors or staff?
I wouldn't say crazy unusual. We do every once. We haven't seen it for the last year, but we used to have a bear that would walk on the property pretty regularly, to the point where we named him Jim the Bear. We do have Eddie the Eagle from down the block. We have a beaver that shows up in the spring and then disappears. We have a river otter. I think the family of foxes are probably the most constant, and those look like they've been here for almost the entirety of Glensheen's history. But they are a kind of a cool thing to see. When you come late night at the property, you'll see the foxes like chasing the different bugs, and there is quite the little, actually, there's actually quite a bit of wildlife. And right now, since we've been closed, when you come down, it feels like a bird sanctuary because there's just so many birds down here right now.
And then this will be our final question here. But are there any virtual tours right now that people might view online?
Also, great softball. Yeah, so we go right to our glensheen.org and you'll see there's a virtual tour. What I recommend are one of two things. To make it way more fun is we also have a downloadable PDF of a treasure hunt. So as you're looking at the different rooms in the virtual tour, it tells you for things to look for. It kind of makes a game out of the virtual tour. I will tell you, it increases the fun level incredibly. We also do have the Glensheen app, and so you can actually read about the rooms directly as you're looking at them. And so that's a very helpful guide too. But the treasure hunt one in particular, I did that with my kids, and my kids lasted through the entire house where they did not do well without it. And so that's just been a fun new way, I think, for people to experience Glensheen. And then lastly, about every other day or so, I try to do a Facebook Live where I do a deep dive on different parts of the house. So if you really want to nerd out with me, it's kind of a fun thing I do, usually around 3 o'clock.
Well, thanks, Dan, for taking the time to chat with us about Glensheen. Hopefully we're able to get to the estate soon. We know that there was lots of questions submitted, and so if your question wasn't answered, feel free to email Glensheen. We do have the information on the next slide, and Dan and his staff will try their best to answer those questions. Also, plan to stay tuned for our upcoming alumni webinar series. Our next one is actually at the Great Lakes Aquarium. So again, just a big thanks for Dan, and we hope that you will join us again for future Bulldogs Behind the Scenes. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, UMD alumni.